My take-home message to you is that unless we can develop global aquaculture, particularly mariculture, that the world is going to face an existential conservation crisis, that we can't rely upon the future of food to be from the terrestrial sphere of this planet. So that's pretty controversial. So we heard this morning. The most stunning thing about this paper in Science was that the demographers were saying that the global population was going to stabilize, literally, 5 years ago, until the recent demography that's coming out saying it's not going to stabilize. So this is the major driver for all change on the planet, not only what the amount of food that we need to produce, but also for the very, very future of the Earth's ecosystem goods and services. So global population is not going to be the same all over the world. Obviously, these people are going to be mainly based in Africa and in Asia. Now, in many of those countries in Africa and Asia, terrestrial proteins is not the major source of animal proteins. It's aquatic sources of protein, not terrestrial. So we need to make sure we understand that this future for those nations is aquatic sources of protein that they prefer in many countries, not terrestrial sources of protein. So this is the population driver that I talked about. Now, we're going to peg it at 10 billion by 2050. Could be as high as 12 billion in 2100. That's the major driver for this new, as a scientist, we follow this as journals called the Anthropocene, which is the new biogeochemical epoch, a geological epoch, where human beings basically control all of the major evolutionary, biological, geological, and chemical cycles on the planet, not biology and chemistry. That's different. And so the crisis that we're facing right now is also a tremendous opportunity. We have the ability to recover and restore this planet and to put us on a better pathway, particularly on a better food ecosystem pathway. So this is my working hypothesis with you, is that the ocean and not the land is the future of food. 70% of the planet is ocean. 97% of all water on the planet is seawater. The freshwaters of this world is only the utilizable freshwaters on this planet is only 0.3% of all of the water on the planet. So right now, only about 4% of all human foods, estimated at about 160 million metric tons, 60 million from capture, 100 million from aquaculture, comes from aquaculture or aquatic foods. And you can see our friends from agriculture produce most of the food for humanity right now. Imagine a plant, just imagine this, that grows fastest in the northern temperate cold winters with very low light and very low photoperiod, small, short days, that produces extraordinary foods for human health and wellness, vitamins, minerals, etc., nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals that are off the chart for human health and wellness, that needs no additional fertilizers, no additional vitamins or any other kinds of additives. And welcome to the kelps. So Asia produces most of these marine agronomic products in the planet right now, but this economy is booming. And it's no longer seaweeds. This is sea vegetables. So the era of sea vegetables is upon us. If we took the EEZs of the world and we looked at those 40 or so countries of the world that have these very large EEZs from 0 to beyond 200 miles, so they're territorial seas. Less than 1% of that developed with these types of sea vegetables would be equal to all of the plants currently farmed in all of the agriculture in the world today. So we now have got who's driving this? You have to look at the entire value chain. Yes, we do science. Our marine science institutions have to change because we've taught students in the next generation of leaders only about production and production and production. We need to teach them about marine entrepreneurship and the entire value chain. Who's driving the sea vegetable economy is these people, is the chefs producing good human food for human health and wellness. So no longer is it's seaweeds, it's sea greens. And this is actually the largest form of food on the planet. It's called detritus. Where does it exist? It exists as a vertical section of the ocean. It actually is caught, when you have a thermocline, you see the temperature is warm at the surface, it changes rapidly as you get deeper, and then it's cold at the bottom. That density, that discontinuity there, the rapid change in temperature is called a thermocline. It's a density discontinuity, and it captures this vast amounts of detritus. This detritus is oftentimes upwards of 70% protein. Very, very high value stuff. And it's actually a protein maximum. If we analyze the amount of protein in the water column, that is literally the world's largest source of protein on the planet. Nothing comes close to it. So if you poise non-fed species, such as these, mussels, oysters, or shellfish, and we have the technologies now to poise these systems, engineering-wise, in the thermocline, the amount of protein that we can produce just off of the EEZ of the United States is equal to all of the swine, chickens, and other farmed animals on the planet in just one EEZ of the world. So the other part that I'd like to emphasize is that we've been doing a lot of work looking at what are the world's most efficient ways of growing the future of food. And what you'll see is that there's a large global consensus, now upwards of 13 papers that say that we are far superior in the water farming parts of the world in terms of any measure of efficiency than any terrestrial crop. This makes common sense in the physicists because aquatic sources of protein, fish, are raised where they don't have to have a big bone structure to support themselves from gravity. They live in a neutrally buoyant environment. So the flesh-to-bone ratio is much, much higher in aquatic sources than it is in any terrestrial sources. And then the other major consensus is this. We work with the seafood doctors in many, many parts of the world. And this is the message that they're saying, that in terms of human health and wellness, a large global consensus among the medical community is arising, that the DHA, EPA, iodine, essential minerals, et cetera, in these foods is far superior to any other terrestrial proteins on the planet. So, and unfortunately, if you look at analysts looking at the future, if you listen to the analysts working in the future of food, to them, quote unquote, food equals terrestrial food. There's probably only 10 of us here in this entire 800s who are talking about aquatic sources of food. But this is what we're facing. This is what we're facing here. This is a high-level expert forum of the FAO, and you can see that we're facing a huge challenge. So how about agriculture in general? So there is a lot of concern about the way agriculture is going. And when you talk to the analysts, you'll see that they're talking about sustainable intensification and freezing agriculture's footprint on the planet. There is about 90% of all of the remaining arable land on this planet, estimated at 1.8 million hectares left, is only in 7 countries in the world. 3 of them in Africa, Congo, Sudan, and in Zimbabwe, and 4 of them in South America, Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, and Argentina. Those countries are the very reservoir of the last remaining Earth's bioreserves, ecosystem goods and services. The Amazon, if we continue to do what we're doing right now, will turn into a carbon source, not to a carbon sink, very soon. So if we decide that the future of food is agriculture's expansion, we will no longer be able to sustain the biogeochemical and ecosystem goods and services, national parks, the great last remaining conservation areas of this planet. We have to find another alternative. Yes, sustainable intensification, but it's highly questionable whether we as a species can hold agriculture's footprint to the current amount of hectares that it consumes. Indeed, if you look at some of these analysts that have talked to in FAO or other major agricultural analysts, what they're saying at the end is that we have to expand arable lands. But they don't take account of the ocean. There's no people who are talking about sustaining the food needs of this planet from that sort of global perspective. Yep. Okay, so I just closed this, and I probably did some damage.
You're right,
Yeah,
actually.
I did. Okay. Okay. So my next message to you is that being an aquaculture scientist, and then my major sort of learning in the last 10 years was to go to the Brussels International Seafood Shows and the Boston International Seafood Shows. And they didn't talk about aquaculture. They didn't talk only about fisheries. They talked about the whitefish market. So it was all substitutable to them. Tilapia substituted for cod in the whitefish market. Salmon market was the redfish market. And so the future of fisheries or of sustainable seafoods was just, in their minds, it was all together. Fisheries, aquaculture, aquatic proteins going to sustain societies. So we can't keep away from trade, and it's a continuum of fisheries and aquaculture, not just aquaculture alone. However, there's some caveats. So this is actually fisheries, and this is probably beyond the sort of maybe understanding of a lot of us in the audience, because we usually stovepipe. I stovepipe for many years over here and capture fisheries. And then most people over there are thinking about polar circles and net pens and salmon and sort of sea bream and sea bass cages and some of those unfed species. These two fields in the middle are probably new to many of you, but actually they're incredibly important. And what we're using is not aquaculture as an end result, but aquaculture as a set of tools. We're a sophisticated society now of scientists, and that toolkit can not only help restore fisheries, but it can also lead to restoring marine ecosystems. So aquaculture is not just salmon or fed carnivorous fish. We oftentimes think that that's a major, because many of us in this audience live in the northern temperate zones. Or we live in Hong Kong or Singapore, where we see those cages, off the coast there in the Indonesian or Javan Sea. But that's only about 5% of all aquaculture. 30% of all global aquaculture is non-fed aquaculture. Sea vegetables, oysters, clams, bivalves. Now, true aquaculture is this. This is true aquaculture, where we actually breed these animals in captivity, and we do broodstock selection out of the adults in captivity. Now, the entire history of this type of aquaculture, industrial aquaculture, is in the lifespan of the man who's speaking to you today. When I first went to China in the late 1970s, early 80s, and I heard that China was the largest aquaculture on the planet, and then I went to the Yangtze and Amur rivers, and I asked, what was all of those fishermen doing out there? And they were dragging giant nets to capture all the juveniles of some of the largest, quote-unquote, aquacultures on the planet to put back in the ponds. There were no hatcheries. And that was in my lifetime. And this supposedly was the largest aquaculture in the world. It was still dependent upon capture fisheries. So this is all new. China just put all of the massive World Bank investments, Chinese investments in common carp, silver carp, bighead carp, all those carp hatcheries. They only put that into place in the 1980s and early 1990s. So this is oftentimes neglected, but this is a giant FAO review of capture-based aquaculture. What it means is that basically we're going out and taking, if in trophic ecology, when a marine species reproduces, it produces billions or millions of eggs, okay? The idea is that we can take just a little bit of that and bring it into aquaculture systems and maybe help sustain the capture fishery too at the same time. So bringing, and you're not going to believe how much of world aquaculture still depends upon the wild. In my state, we are the third largest fishery in the state of Maine, is elvers, eels. All of global aquaculture, nearly all, 90 to 95% of all global eel aquaculture, if you love your unagi on top of your sushi, that depends upon wild capture of eels from the wild. It depends upon my state of Maine. And my state of Maine exports millions and millions of dollars of elvers live to China, Taiwan, and Korea, where they grow out all these eels in aquaculture ponds, and then they send them back to us in the West as unagi on top of our sushi. So just remember, now the Japanese have been they've spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to close the life cycle of eels. And it's an art form. It's not a science still. So the question now, if you take capture-based aquaculture, is that can we just use a little bit of that to develop sustainable community-based aquaculture systems everywhere? And then this one is, have you had your wild salmon today? This is the home of wild salmon. Dr. Costa-Pierce, you are in British Columbia, and we do not like farm salmon. We are going to have wild salmon. So I asked my friends in Alaska, after Alaska made aquaculture illegal to grow aquacultured salmon, when I flew over Prince William Sound and I asked what those polar circles, they look just like Norway to me, what those were all down there. Oh, those were enhancement hatcheries. They're using all of the aquaculture toolbox, and what are we doing? What are we doing? This is the North Pacific. About almost 9,000 million salmon smolts are put out into the North Pacific ecosystem from aquaculture hatcheries every single year, and then the branding and marketing people are telling us they're wild. Okay? So see how this all fits together. Okay, aquaculture and fisheries are absolutely intertwined today. You cannot separate them and we do not want to separate them to deliver an accelerated amount of sustainable seafoods to this planet. So we can do all of this. Let's say if we did all of this up in capture fisheries. I've spent a career up in capture fisheries also. Say we did it all. If we did it all, how much would that give to 2050? If we restored all of the world's capture fisheries, FAO projections show that we'd only meet about 20% of all human needs. So we have to find a way to sustainably increase aquaculture. So there's two tracks in this. You can see I'm being very broad. I could go how we're making industrial aquaculture more sustainable. In order to make industrial aquaculture more sustainable, one of the things that we need to do is get an accelerated social contract from the coastal public to enhance sustainable aquaculture. And oftentimes that comes down to the viewscape, to our top priority right now is submerged technologies. You don't see polar circles at the surface. You are down in the middle of the water column doing detrital, or you're doing non-fed species. And the second one is more community-based. These species down here are very community-based. These are in major industrial, multinational aquaculture. But down here, these bring enormous amounts of community benefits. So we wrote a paper about this social contract, and we're working intensely on this because we forget that aquaculture is who we are as sophisticated people living on this planet. There is absolutely nothing new about aquaculture. There have been blue revolutions that have been happening for thousands of years, and this paper recovers a number of them. And some of these blue revolutions are so stunning that you cannot believe that possibly parts of the Amazon are a human-created construct because millions of people used to live there and had chinampa systems that were vastly sophisticated, integrated agriculture, aquaculture farming systems. We've seen so many blue revolutions in our past. Certainly the best known is the Chinese Blue Revolution, Fan Li, who wrote the original book about Chinese aquaculture, okay? Why did they do it? In about that time in 470 BC, there were the first major capture fisheries regulations for ocean depletions off the coast of China in 470 BC. Indeed, here's our working hypothesis with some of our anthropology friends, that whenever the population density of seafood-eating peoples, that's important. Americans, Canadians, they're not seafood-eating peoples. They eat about 160 pounds of beef or kilos of beef and only about 15 kilos of seafood. But whenever the population density of seafood-eating peoples exceeds their ability to derive their protein needs from the wild, they develop aquaculture. And so there's been aquaculture revolutions throughout human history, whenever these seafood-eating peoples could not get their protein from the wild. So we looked at ecology as the paradigm for the future of aquaculture. How are we going to get this accelerated social contract? So we've been working with FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, to develop an ecosystems approach to aquaculture and come up with guidelines. You've probably seen many of these in many, many different industries throughout the world, and so terrestrial industries. You'll see these words being used. But it's a strategy, and how you have these, again, very, very wonderful words. How do you do it? You have to have not only the natural ecology, but you have to have the social ecology. And it's the participation of stakeholders. So, in other words, how many coastal communities have we worked with where the first thing they heard about aquaculture being developed in either the waters off of their lands or on their lands itself was in the newspaper? They didn't hear about it as a participatory strategy which could be providing excellent food for human health and wellness, jobs, local economic development, as well as export. So you can see this is now, I'm going into social ecology. I'm sort of way beyond my comfort zone, but I had to learn this. In order to develop aquaculture in a commons, see where this is published in conservation biology, we have to bring in these people. We have to get right at the outset the discussion, a knowledge-based process about knowledge-based foods, some of the biggest knowledge-based foods on the planet. So when I was a kid, when I studied aquaculture in a book that was just about this thick in 1976, that's what we needed to do. If we could put mommy and daddy together in the hatchery and produce babies and produce the seed, if we could get the feed there to feed them, they would eat it and grow, and then we had the markets, we'd be making money. Well, that's not the new world. This is the new world for aquaculture. This is how aquaculture is going to grow worldwide. Because the jobs and economic development are not only in this, there's actually a lot less jobs in that center circle. The real jobs are in the outside interactions, the real professions for my students, for the next generation of coastal leaders worldwide is on those outer interactions. So we already have a social contract for some species. And the ones that I just talked about here, bivalves, we have the National Academy of Sciences of the United States weighing in here that we do have, and this is directly from that report, there's been a remarkable convergence of the science platform. I've talked about submerged technologies in the thermocline, using vast amounts of detritus. We poise these mussels at 30 meters off of the North Atlantic coast of where I'm from. They grew so fast that the calcium metabolism of the shells couldn't keep up with the tissue metabolism, and we actually produced a new animal. They couldn't pack the mussels in a regular old mussel bag because all the shells broke. They were this big, they had meats this thick, and they weren't aquatic cows. Oftentimes, we place these animals, bivalves like this, in areas where we think the grass of the sea is present. And little did we know that it's not just phytoplankton or algae that they eat. They're not aquatic cows. They're actually omnivorous grazers. And they grew so fast that some of the marketing people were very scared, actually, because they were thinking, oh, they'll never take Prince Edward Island mussels anymore. Everybody, the consumers all want these. So a whole new revolution here is arising about species that have a vast social contract where the science is there, and then we're ready, just ready for development worldwide. Why is not happening? Well, it's not happening because the major investors, whether they be multinational banks, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, or national aid agencies, GTZ, USAID, ICETA, Swedish CETA, all of these development aids, Canadian CETA, all of them actually put the vast amount of their money into agriculture and agriculture expansion and sustainable intensification. And they completely neglect the ocean as part of the future, for a future of food. So I'm going to start ending on this one because I wanted to also expand your notion a little bit about aquaculture. You probably are walking into this room and saying it's growing food in water only. And then you can go to see these kinds of efforts worldwide. Now, it's okay to do this on the land. You can actually do what some scientists call silviculture. You produce baby trees. And then you can actually then have an Arbor Day, which is in the United States. All children and people with their families go run around and restore our national parks by planting trees. Now, doing that in the ocean is something strange, sometimes very controversial, but we're actually using the aquaculture toolbox now. This is marine agronomy. See these vast areas of eelgrass that we all know are incredibly important for juvenile production in marine fisheries worldwide. And that's an eelgrass sled where we have a hatchery taking the seeds from eelgrass. And we're planting out vast areas of eelgrass. And see over here? An effective seed production method for planting eelgrass. Implications for their large-scale restoration. Notice it's not published in an aquaculture journal. It's published in Marine Pollution Bulletin. But this is part of the aquaculture toolbox. How about coral reefs? We know how to reproduce almost every major coral on this planet, including most of the endangered species. At my university, we have an entire coral lab where students frag corals. The problem is if we can do all of this now, we need to solve the water quality problems. We just can't put a coral garden out there in the midst of a polluted marine environment. So that's another participatory. But look at this paper. Farming the reef is aquaculture the solution to reducing pressure on coral reefs. And then mangroves. Again, look at where it's published in a journal called Ecological Engineering. Vast amounts of mangroves being restored using marine agronomic techniques, the aquaculture toolbox, breaking down all of these old barriers about aquaculture in that word. So these now, the lexicon is a whole bunch of new adjectives. Conservation aquaculture, restoration aquaculture. Then also putting out large amounts of shellfish from aquaculture hatcheries, and then putting them out onto clam flats all over the world. Now, those of you from BC, you may say, wow, you know, that's an interesting, maybe new idea. The indigenous First Nations of this place had some of the most sophisticated shellfish hatcheries. First of all, shellfish is part of their gestalt, their culture. It's one of their major foods in historical times. But if you look at the history, his story and her story about the First Nations in this very place, you'll see they had some of the most sophisticated, ecologically developed and managed shellfish hatcheries ever known. So as scientists now today are going back and talking to the indigenous people, say, how did you do that? You know, we have to use all of these tanks and these big pumps and other things like that. So here it is. You know, it's just sort of summarizing it, is that basically we can not only, we can also help the Earth's damaged fisheries from aquarium fisheries. We still do aquarium fisheries, one of the largest economic sort of entities in the aquatic world in the world today. So if we do all of this aquarium fish in aquaculture, we can save some of the reefs from being overfished by aquarias. Okay, and I'm going to end on this one because seafood is the world's largest, is the most widely traded food commodity on the planet. FAO says about half of all the seafood on the planet is traded widely. So again, I can't be in the next generation of leaders, we just can't be in the capture and fisheries comfort zone. You must take account of global trade. And with climate change and the Anthropocene, prepare to be surprised. Because we have something going on. I just came back from the Arctic Circle conference in Reykjavik, Iceland. And what's going on in the Arctic will affect every single person in this room, our children, and all nations on the planet. Because this is what's going on. We're having blue crabs from the Chesapeake in the United States now caught in Newfoundland. We're seeing cod almost extirpated, completely commercially gone from the southern reaches of New England and ending up way far north in the Barents Sea. They're not all dead and dying from fisheries. They're moving tremendously. And what this is doing is presenting a vast new opportunity and challenge for us as a species. So this is a recent review in Fisheries Oceanography. And these are the species that are going to move. And the ones that I want to talk to you today about is cod and haddock, because they're part of this whitefish market. So if you're in the tilapia world producing whitefish, you can't neglect this because it's so big. There is so much cod and haddock coming from the Barents Sea right now that it swamps any other proposal I could imagine in the northern temperate zone for cod or haddock aquaculture. And that's how much you need to pay attention to the surprises that climate change are giving us. So this is what the Arctic looks like now. And what's happening is that the ice is not only the extent is going away, you all heard that, but it's thinning. And there's lakes all over it, okay? And what these lakes are now is incredibly productive of basic phytoplankton and zooplankton. The highest production of any lower trophic level species of food that has been known anywhere on the planet. That includes the Benguela current off of Africa and the Peruvian current off of Peru. Higher productivity. So we're seeing a vast explosion of life in the peri-Arctic areas of the Arctic, particularly in this area of the Barents Sea. So this is the joint FAO 2014 and Norwegian Fisheries Joint Commission reports from ICES. Okay, and you see that number. That's a really big number. So the other numbers is the entire aquaculture production of the continent of Africa, of Europe, the Americas, and Oceania. So this is a really big number. That's the amount of cod and whitefish coming now from these new areas. It swamps, literally, the production of many aquaculture nations. And it's new. And can we sustain it? And can we make value-added products from it? So taking the sustainability science from this and food, I'm calling for this broader group to come together worldwide. Ocean food systems and the entire value chain. These are some of the attributes that we need to pay attention to. This is a big global multinational group where we need to have, as I've mentioned, natural and social ecology. So this is what FAO has said in its last report, is that people like me and academics or trainers of people who are going to be involved in the seafood revolution in the world, we're not doing a good job. We're stovepiping these fields away from each other. We're not teaching the next generation that these are very interactive. And FAO is calling out to us to break down all of these walls between capture fisheries, aquaculture, and seafood trade. So this is what I'm going to leave you with, is that I think that with the consensus of efficiency, with the human health and wellness, and with a crying need for us to birth a new source of food on this planet that doesn't burden the terrestrial sphere, that I think the ocean is the way to go. Thank you very much.